Welcome to our session on geotechnological futures. We are witnessing a growing interconnectedness of technological competition and the competition for global power. So technology is part of every aspect of our life by now. It's a part of our businesses, part of our sciences, part of our economies and our social interactions. And by consequence, technological competition has great influence on the future of economic growth and influence and power. But what we're seeing is that at the same time, technological competition is influencing the world order. And we believe it will be a determining factor in how global power might shift in the coming decades. And so the race for that technological superiority that is going on is tightly linked to the race for geoeconomic and geopolitical power. And it's the implications of this rapidly evolving phenomenon that will impact a lot of stakeholders in the world in a variety of ways. It goes well beyond the security area. And we need to start thinking about what it might mean for our economies and our societies also. For example, in terms of market access, consumer protection, and so forth. But we have here today with us 4 distinguished experts that will together shed some light for us on this. They will be talking to you about how geotechnological futures might look like in the future, what that means in terms of the implications for our societies and stakeholders, and ultimately what countries, institutions, firms, and people should be thinking about to prepare for these futures. So let me start by introducing you to our amazing panel, I have to say. First of all, I would welcome Rohinton Medhora. He's the president of the Center for International Governance Innovation. Welcome, Rohinton. Secondly, we have Florence Gaub. She is the Foresight advisor in the General Secretariat of the Council in the European Union. Bienvenue, welcome, Florence. And we also have with us Chris Meserole. He's a fellow in foreign policy at the Brookings Institution and the director of research for the Brookings Artificial Intelligence and Emerging Technology Initiative. He's also an adjunct professor at Georgetown University. Welcome, Chris. And last but certainly not least, Jeff Nankivell. He's the president and CEO of the Asia Pacific Foundation, and prior to that, for 33 years, he was in the Canadian Foreign Service. Welcome, Jeff. So for this session, we have opted to not do the typical moderated conversation, but rather to give space for Florence, Rohinton, Chris, and Jeff to have a conversation among themselves. And we will be listening in to their insights. But to start them off, I will start with a question to Rohinton. So Rohinton, in your experience and broadly speaking, is it in the nature of economics of new technologies to breed conflict amongst countries? Or is there room for international cooperation? And how might we think about competition versus cooperation in the future as it comes to technology? Rohinton, the floor is yours.
Kristel, thank you. And first, let me thank you for your foresight in organizing this panel, and thank you for thinking of me for it. It's always good to be with colleagues at Policy Horizons. The question you pose is actually timely and important. And speaking as an economist, I'd say there's on the one hand and on the other, by which I mean this. There is inherent conflict in new technologies and in the use of big data for 2 reasons. One is I'm so broadly generalizing at this point, is that the field is characterized by what we would call economies of scale. The bigger you are, the better you are. And the better you are, the more clients you attract. The more clients you attract, the more profitable you are. The more profitable you are, the bigger you are, and the better you become. And so if I use big data as an example, you need a lot of fixed costs and risk-taking up front. And if you succeed, success breeds success. And so this is what has sometimes been called the winner-take-all sort of feeling in the technology. And it's not wrong, and therefore it's not a surprise that this is a field in which monopoly and oligopoly tend to be the market structures. We worry a lot about competition. Although consumers seemingly receive services for free, we worry a lot about consumer welfare and social welfare, and with good reason. And so inherently that is conflictual. The second reason this field is conflictual is, unlike traditional areas, we do not have the institutions to mediate conflict. This is, by definition, a new field. And so the structures we have globally, and even nationally, but let's start globally, date back 40, 50, 60 years. Bretton Woods, San Francisco, and then the odd change thereafter, the World Trade Organization some decades ago. But really, we don't have the structures we need to govern global digital economies and global digital societies. So for those two reasons, the economies of scale and the lack of institutions, we have conflict. Now, what's the potential for cooperation? The potential for cooperation is exactly the flip side to what I just said. There are huge profits at stake. There's enough in it for everyone if they did cooperate. And as we're seeing with the weaponization of the SWIFT payment system, there are huge losses if you don't belong in the system. And so inherently, there's something for every country to want to belong in this system, because the gains then spill over into other parts of your economy as well. The second area of cooperation that I see is actually building the institutions, a la 1944 and 1945, that we require. I mean, this is what global governance and global diplomacy is all about. And so there's conflict, but there's also opportunity. And it is this of conflict and opportunity dynamic that sort of addresses your second question, which was, how should we see and how do these two feed off each other? In the absence of rules and governance, there will always be conflict. It is the job of countries jointly and within their own national economies, and I know we'll come to this later in the panel, to create the structures which are cooperative. And so that actually, Kristel, leads me to ask Florence a question, which is exactly the point about, is technology a tool to create power, or is it a power unto itself? What is the dynamic between, if you will, US and China, or between two large firms, when it comes to using technology to become better?
I think it's a little bit chicken and egg, the question. It's almost philosophical. Although I think when you go back in time, you'll find that historically, we used to think of technology exclusively as something that supported power, be it in terms of weapon systems or innovation in the tech sector, becoming an advantage on the international market, etc. I mean, this is a very 60s, 70s view I'm painting here. And I would say that today it has shifted in that, in first order, AI, face recognition and stuff, tech like that, actually makes it possible to control populations. So it is a tool to stabilize, enforce power, but it's of course also geostrategic power. Right now you just mentioned China, the United States. So the tech sector becomes a symbol of competition. Who invests more in R&D? Who has more patents, etc. So what I find interesting about this is that something we observe in all sectors, if you just think of food security or energy right now, everything is becoming more and more enmeshed. Everything is about power in the end. Everything is connected, just in the same way that all economies are connected. So I would say there is no simple answer to your question, but it is linked to each other. The other thing is, again, the conundrum of the modern times or postmodern times is that we're also connected to each other. Does that mean, is that a good thing or a bad thing? I mean, we just see an uncoupling also in the tech sector. So it's dependence, especially, for instance, for raw materials, for rare earth elements that you need to advance in certain technological products. Does that hold you back in geopolitical terms? So I think we all have more questions than answers about this, but I think one thing is clear, is what I just said, that technology is an element in the broader landscape landscape of power, and as such needs to be understood, I think, also in the holistic sense. So sorry for that not being clear in a yes or no kind of way, but I think more generally that leads me to a question I have for Chris, which is, why is it that technology has become such a fault line for geopolitical competition? I mean, we're looking, of course, again, China, US, but it's not the only area. Why do you think is that?
It's a great question, Florence, and thank you for asking, and thank you again for the organizers for putting this together. It's a really fantastic and fantastic event. To your question, I think there's kind of two parts to it. One is, where, how has technology, as you put it, really become such a fulcrum of geopolitics today? And then the question is what to do about it at both kind of a macro level and a micro level, which I'll get to. But as far as kind of building on what you were saying about technology and its relationship to power, I think if you zoom out a bit, the way that we got here was that a couple of centuries or a couple of generations ago, in the early post-war era, geopolitics was really about industrial power and kind of industrial policy and industrial capacity. And then what happened kind of later in the Cold War, starting in the 1970s, but really in the 1980s, one of the things that was really decisive in kind of the victory of the Democratic alliance in the Cold War was really the capacity to produce and outperform the Soviet bloc when it comes to the digital economy and digital technologies, even as emerging as they were. The internet still wasn't even commercialized at that point, but the early kind of forms of digital technology were already producing capabilities in the United States and its allies that the Soviets couldn't match. And then there was kind of this decisive demonstration of it in the early 1990s and the Iraq War, the ability of precision-guided munitions to really revolutionize warfare in many ways with just the speed of that conflict. And what came out of that is, I think, a recognition among the other great powers, kind of in particular China and Russia, that the international order of the last, really the last 75 years, but really the last 30 years has been predicated on the supremacy of Western and democratic technologies. And when I say that, I mean like technologies that are produced primarily and developed primarily in democratic countries. And China, I think, kind of noticed that, China in particular, and has kind of doubled down on investing in that area over the beginning in the early 1980s, but really over the last decade or two has seen technology as a way that it could potentially begin to exert greater influence geopolitically. They're not the only one. I think other regional powers have also realized that they may have kind of a differentiated advantage in certain parts of the technology chain that they're trying to now leverage for geopolitical purposes as well. But the core, I think, point is that the ability to exert and wield geopolitical power in many ways comes from the ability to produce better technology and to project that power both in the economic realm and the military realm. And so it's kind of led to this emphasis among Russia and China in particular and other regional powers to make sure that they have capabilities with technology that can match their competitors. What that's also led to, though, is I think a growing sense among democracies that we need to figure out how to better govern these technologies. As Florence mentioned, these aren't just kind of geopolitical instruments, they also have democratic kind of implications for domestic politics when it comes to things like surveillance or kind of information environments, especially in democracies. And there's this real question of, how do we govern these technologies? What standards do we need to use? How do we develop? How do we come together as a group of democracies to develop those standards? There's a lot of, work to be done that we're seeing like early forms of that with things like the TTC, and kind of the Quad starting to move together to work on technology issues and develop, a good democratic posture for technology governance. But that's only part of it. There's also this kind of issue of how, at a micro level, institutions and firms and nonprofits should be thinking about technology as well. And on that point, I really want to make sure that we were able to dive deeper on that point. And so I want to bring in Jeff to speak a bit about that as well. Jeff, so far we've talked a lot about kind of technology at a high level. We haven't quite talked about it as much at a smaller level or kind of a more micro level. And so, what does this mean in your view, if you're a company or you're a university or an NGO, and what are some of the implications of all that we've been discussing when it comes to kind of the actual decisions and future planning for those kinds of organizations?
Well, it's a real issue for firms. It's been a real issue for years now. I think at least half a decade, and it's a very good question. And these are questions we all need to be asking ourselves, because we're making, as governments and as societies globally, we're making choices now that will have impacts on our development paths collectively and in each of our jurisdictions, for decades to come. Where I work at the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada, we sit at the intersection of the public sector and the private sector and the academic and think tank world. And so we see this from different angles. For firms, in terms of the particularly the U.S.-China technological rivalry, this clearly has been an issue already for firms in the tech space in those countries, but also in Western Europe, in countries like Canada, Australia, Japan, South Korea. This has led companies already to make choices, and as Rohinton pointed out, in the absence of any really clear governance or architecture around technology globally, companies have had to make choices about whether to explore, for instance, a Canadian company with a sensitive technology. Do I explore the China market? If I do so, could be tremendous opportunities, but I will be putting at risk my ability to not just to sell into the U.S. market, but maybe to have people on my company board who come from the U.S. or who could be subject to pressure or sanctions in some way, and it may limit my ability to attract investment as an entrepreneur. I think for the university sector, it's a huge issue, and I think we'll come back to this later in the discussion, so I won't go deep on this at the moment, but just simply put, that there is in a number of Western jurisdictions, and we have some measures in Canada, others are further ahead, like in the US and Australia and the United Kingdom. There are measures being put in place that really put pressure on research partnerships between researchers and institutions in these Western countries and partners in China. And that has really far-reaching effects for individuals as well as institutions, and I think for our economies. And finally, for institutions, all of this takes place in a political context. We're talking a lot about technology, but these are political issues now, and not only that, they're highly politicized issues. And I think there is a really critical role for independent public purpose institutions like think tanks, like the Brookings Institution, like CIGI, like the Asia Pacific Foundation, think tanks in Europe and elsewhere, to really fight to maintain a space where we can have objective analysis, because this kind of dialectical process of, for public debates, public policy can be well served by having a kind of an adversarial system like we're used to seeing in the common law tradition in the courts, but it can be critically undermined if we can't have some agreed upon facts, and we really have to fight for that space as institutions. And that brings me back to the governance question, and Rohinton, I'd like to come back to you, if I may, to ask you about if you're seeing in your work any particular national or regional models of governance that might serve as models and help to point the way for making progress on creating governance models and systems that serve us all better than what we have now.
Yeah, Jeff, look, first I'd say I wholeheartedly endorse many of the things that have been said, but two things you said. One is that firms need certainty, and that's overdoing it in the absence of clear regulations is the worst form of uncertainty. I'm paraphrasing what you said and putting words in your mouth. And second, that there's a role for think tanks and policy research more broadly to keep lines of communication open in troubled times. As to your question, I'm going to sort of limit myself to data for now. There's three broad data zones in the world. You have the state-centric data zone in China, where effectively the data is in the public, or should I say, in the government's realm, and the spillover effects and everything else, positive and negative, managed by the authorities. Its mirror image, and I say mirror image, not opposite, is in the US, where data is mostly controlled by big tech firms. And the reason the Chinese and US systems are more similar than they're apart is because in both cases, the citizen is disempowered. And so what you have is the middle ground, which I think most, if not all countries in the world probably aspire to and pay lip service to. And that's the regime in the European Union, the GDPR, in which nominally at least, and there are criticisms about the GDPR, and we can get into them, Florence would know them well, but the fact is this is where the citizen is at the center. The citizen has control to some extent over how his or her data is used and not used, and how it is aggregated, and to what extent our self is in the public realm. That leaves out the large majority of the world. If you don't belong to one of those three data zones, Canada doesn't, India doesn't, Australia doesn't, all of Africa doesn't, you pretty much are a regime taker. You either sign on to one of those, or you're influenced by the geopolitics of whoever's dominant in your region, or you try and create a fourth way. And so I think the challenge, to build on what I said in my opening remarks for global diplomacy, is to find a way to make these three zones more compatible with each other, because currently they're not. You cannot be a global firm currently because you simply cannot manage data, which is the core of your business model in most cases, the same in those three zones. And so we've balkanized the one part of globalization that holds the most potential, but is also fraught with the fewest forms of governance, or should I say, barely any. Therefore, to answer your question, are the models out there? I'd say in terms of the ideal, in terms of the concern for political system and social stability and so on, the GDPR is where it's at. And in fact, many state-level regulations, such as in California, preambles, including preambles to China's data law, sound a lot like GDPR. That, I think, is the ideal we should be striving for. GDPR does put an onus on, a bigger onus on small firms to comply than large firms, just because compliance costs tend to be fixed costs. And so they bear down more heavily on small firms than large firms, which can afford to do the compliance and find ways around and hire lots of lawyers and all the rest of it. But still, the question that data belongs to the person and that data is a public good, which is central to the GDPR way of looking at things, I think is the model. The only other point I'd make here on models out there is I think we should be looking out for the Indian stack, and we should be looking out for India's stewardship, assuming the G20 survives that long, of the G20 next year. The Indian stack is an interesting one. Here's a largely poor, large democratic country with democratic ideals, sometimes fraying, imperfect, but nevertheless democratic, that has a globally renowned digital ID system, that has a national financial inclusion program, that has a digital payments system that's budding, and increasingly a digital health system. And so what India is trying to do is kind of take the best of these different models and blend them together into something that is truly developmentally wise, that is economically and business wise, and take it forward. And I think this is my sort of example of a fourth way, is that if the Indias, Canadas, Australias of the world come together, because the three dominant players, Europe, China, and the US, aren't really willing or able to do the mediation. Each of them is conflicted. I think we're going to need an era of that outside diplomacy for countries to step in and take charge and make it happen. Last point on this, I think good diplomacy starts with a strong national foundation. If, as a country, you don't have a strong national privacy regime, if you don't have a strong national approach to innovation and data, or if you've already signed away your degrees of freedom, then your ability to participate internationally is curtailed. The reason I say all of that is because certainly at CIGI, colleagues of mine, and sometimes I, have written about the fact that at Canada, although we're making great strides, we are not there. And when it comes to data and innovation governance, we're a step behind many of the major players. In CUSMA, we have signed away some of our degrees of freedom in terms of being able to manage big tech. And so we have some ways to go internationally, on the international stage, simply because at the national level, we were a bit of a latecomer to this, and the world is moving on. So with that kind of dire thought, let me come back to Florence and ask you, Florence, whether you think we're looking at geopolitics of technology the right way. What if we were to look at it with a different perspective? What might we see? And how could we think or act differently as a result?
Thank you, Rohinton. I think this is a super interesting question because when you look at how humans used to look at technology, or rather the future of technology in the past, they always oscillate between the extremes. And there's an excellent book by Lawrence Friedman called The Future of War, A History. Most people forget the second part of the title, which I think is the most important one, because it's not about the future of war. It's about the history of how people used to look at war. And the dominant feature is constantly always underestimating the human factor and overestimating the technological factor. And this is not just in the realm of conflict and military matters. We see that also in other areas. Just remember the SMS. When the SMS was developed, it was a for free add-on. Nobody thought that people would actually enjoy writing short messages to each other. So the unknown factor for me is not so much technology and what it can do, but how humans will react to it, or what humans will do to it. And I think this echoes also through your comments on the GDPR and you know, how it's not just about data, but how do humans manage data? How do humans want their data to be managed, right? So I think that the big unknown here isn't what devices can we invent, what kind of innovation can we come up with, but what will humans do with it? And I think this is, for me, the most interesting question. So what I would like to see in order to change our perspectives of things, rather than, you know, oscillate between these extremes, like, you know, what will AI do? Well, AI will be like electricity. AI can transform everything for the better or for the worse. It depends on what you're going to do with it. We need more studies. We need really human test, how do I put this, not labs, I don't want to put humans in labs, but we need to test out how people would respond to certain technologies. What would they like to do with it? What do they not want to do with it, etc., etc. So for me, that would be the main feature. How to look at it differently is not so much change our perspectives, but rather bring the human factor in. Now, perhaps one note, what we do know is, I just mentioned that in the past we used to overestimate, or actually we still do a lot of ways, overestimate technology and underestimate the human factor. What we do see in one thing, and I think Ukraine is a very good example for this, we do see that small states, or rather states that are on the defensive, they can benefit from certain modern technologies, you know, such as drones, for instance. So technology is likely to change at least the conflict landscape, but again, not in not in the sense that conflict will go away or become extremely more or less lethal. The numbers, this might be shocking news for some of you, but the numbers on lethality of conflict have actually been pretty stable since the Napoleonic Wars. Lethality means that the number of people involved, the percentage of number of people involved in a war that will die. So since the modern weapons, even the most primitive early versions, were introduced to the battlefield, wars have become more lethal. That's a fact. But since then, this number has not gone significantly up or down. So those of you who dream of technology making war clean, I think that's going to remain a pipe dream. So our real front line for me isn't per se technology, even though of course that's an important aspect, but human beings and why they fight and what do they do when they fight. Again, I mean, I've said this earlier, but technology is never in a vacuum, and it's very important that we bridge these gaps as we're doing today, and that we think about the long term. I mean, this week isn't revolving around visioning for nothing. The future isn't just preparing for the worst case, it's also envisioning what we want for it. And I think that's one of the key elements to keep in mind, or something we should be doing. Don't be afraid of technology. Just put it in front of people to test out what would they do with it, what would they not want to do with it, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, same goes for the metaverse. We can speculate, will it be a success or not? Ultimately, once we've seen humans play with it and decide whether they like it or not, then we will know. So bring the human factor back into technology. That brings me to a question I have for Chris. I mean, we touched on this just now. Chris, how do the economic and security implications of these dual-use technologies intersect? I mean, I keep jumping around between conflict and the private sector. There is a reason for it, I guess. It's because they're so difficult to disentangle. But why do you think is that?
Thanks, Florence. It's a great question. And before I get into it, I just want to underscore the importance of the human dimension to any use of technology. That technology in itself, I think it's very easy to fall into the trap of just kind of over-determining the future based on trends in technology. And I think we lose sight of just how important the human dimension is. And I think even in the realm of conflict, I think we can actually see that playing out in Ukraine right now, where Russia kind of was presumed to have much better technology. And it turns out if you don't have an organizational structure for your military that allows for unit level combatants to take advantage of that technology, it's not actually a very effective fighting force. I mean, how many really extraordinarily high-tech anti-air systems and artillery systems were just abandoned in the first couple of weeks of that war, right? And they were never actually used, because I think people just underestimated how important that human and organizational side is. To your question about the integration of economic and security implications of this technology, I do want to stress that I think one thing that's different than past conversations on technology and geopolitical importance is that most of many of like the defining military technologies of the kind of last geopolitical era, for example, during the Cold War, it was the core military technology in that case was nuclear weapons, and it was, there's some dual use with nuclear energy, but by and large, that technology was confined to the military realm. What's different now with digital technology is that, even though the Silicon Valley itself kind of came out of the efforts in the 1950s of the U.S. government to fund some defense-related electromagnetic companies, to kind of drive forward things like radar and early computing. Those kind of companies have now kind of grown. The Silicon Valley itself, I don't think views itself at all as a military kind of an appendage of the military anymore in the way that they might have 70 years ago. I think we've seen this just massive proliferation again starting in the 1980s, 1990s, and just accelerating the last couple of decades of technology companies using things like artificial intelligence in particular, but other adjacent digital technologies as well, to drive extraordinary economic gains and to be able to scale out products and services globally, and to accrue just a tremendous amount of wealth and productivity improvements using these technologies in a purely commercial sense. The challenge now is that if AI is kind of a key strategic technology, the primary drivers and developers of that technology are not military institutions or defense contractors. They are almost entirely large tech firms who serve primarily consumer audiences and consumer, a large consumer base around the world. And so the question is, if you're trying to maintain a certain advantage geopolitically when it comes to defining security technology like AI, you can't do that in the way that you might have with nuclear weapons, because there's this just massive implications on the economic side. In particular, there's this issue that's emerged over the last 30 years where the supply chains for most of our electronics industry and digital technology industry now intersect or kind of built up very heavily in East Asia. There's, I would say, the most important time zone in the world is that kind of east coast of China, going down from Beijing all the way down through East Asia. I believe it's the most populous zone, but it's also the most important geopolitically when it comes to digital technology, because that's where all the supply chains are. And it makes it very fraught to try and think about decoupling. If, even though policymakers may think that we have a strategic advantage on something like AI, fully decoupling from China, which is our kind of strategic competitor, would be catastrophic to the global economy. I think we're worried about inflation now because of COVID disruptions to supply chains. If we were to kind of deliberately prevent the construction of iPhones, for example, in China, or kind of a wide array of other digital technologies from within China, there's literally nowhere else in the world that can produce those products at the scale that they're currently being produced, and it would be just grossly cataclysmic for the global economy that we've developed. So I think what will happen instead is we'll start to see greater emphasis played on kind of selective forms of decoupling, where products that don't have ready complements, like things like not chips, but the semiconductor manufacturing equipment that produces processors, we'll see kind of ways of trying to decouple the production and sale of those technologies into kind of US blocks, or kind of American and democratic blocks versus Chinese blocks. But I'd be surprised to see a full-on decoupling, just because the consequences would be so severe for the global economy writ large. And on that point, I want to turn to Jeff, who's done a lot of work on this as well, and just kind of get your feel, Jeff, for what would actually decoupling, what would the implications of that mean for Canadians and for kind of, consumers and the research world?
Well, I think we as I mentioned, firms in some sectors have already been feeling that in the choices that they've made to, either avoid the China market, or to go into the China market and choose to risk cutting themselves off from some opportunities, let's say in the American market. And before kind of digging deeper on Canadians specifically, I would like to make a larger point, and I think it was really good that Rohinton touched on this, that you have these three, the kind of three digital spheres, kind of the US, China, and Europe. And there's a huge portion of the global population and global society that is not governed by any of those three. And I think it's a really important contextual factor when we think about the prospects for decoupling, which would be really kind of driven as a US-China thing, or maybe a US and the EU on one side and China on the other, which is that we work at the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. We're working with partners across Asia and the Asia Pacific region, and most of them are not buying into this idea. I mean, they are really stoutly resisting the idea that they should have to choose. And you can see just even some recent statements. Singapore is a great example of this, and is a country that punches above its weight in geopolitics for a variety of reasons. But this new Biden administration initiative on an Indo-Pacific economic framework, which started out in its launch, last week as with an exclusive kind of tone to it. Certain countries were invited. Singapore signed up for that, but they said at the same time, we don't want to have to choose between the U.S. and China. So I think we shouldn't assume that the world will harden into two camps. That may be really pushing uphill for those in the U.S. and in China who advocate for that, and there are influential voices for sure who are pushing for that kind of a world vision. But I think they're pushing against resistance in a bunch of places. That said, it is happening in some sectors already, and it does have impacts that go beyond the firms in the tech sphere who have to make choices about one market or another. The most obvious example, I think, has been touched on, which is for consumers. And I mean, I'm not just talking about iPhones, but right through the whole range of products that are produced. Decoupling could have impacts on supply chains that affect all kinds of things, including a lot of goods and services, but especially goods that are consumed by people at the bottom of the pyramid who are very price sensitive. And for all the talk about resilience in supply chains and diversifying, and of course that makes sense, and we've seen that through the global pandemic, it makes sense to diversify your supplies. That's sort of basic common sense. But everyone, I think, also recognizes that you don't do that at any cost whatsoever. Like you don't take it to extremes, and we could find ourselves very quickly getting to points in some sectors where trying to move supply chains away from the places where they have sort of organically settled is going to have real costs for consumers. In the research sphere, we're really feeling this across academic institutions and other kinds of research, private research labs in a number of jurisdictions. And the kind of short version of the story is that where measures are being brought in by governments to try to constrain or patrol or screen research collaborations between institutions in countries like Canada and partners in China. We have seen in places, I've mentioned the US, Australia, the UK, to some extent already in Canada, a real chilling effect on research partnerships. And there is such a big, serious risk of overshooting in these efforts. First of all, if you're going to do it, if you're going to regulate it as a government, you need to be properly equipped to regulate it. You need to have well-qualified, serious people with expertise to be making those judgments if you're going to be providing guidance to universities and firms on what's okay and what's not okay, because these have really material consequences. Secondly, you need to do it in a way that is sensitive to the rights of citizens and residents of your jurisdiction. We have seen, and there's lots of anecdotal evidence of, for example, researchers of Chinese ethnic origin feeling that they have been harassed, or telling the story of having been harassed and intimidated, visited by government agents, finding themselves shut out of grant applications because it's going to complicate things. If you have someone who might have family ties to China as part of your grant application, there are huge risks to our society and things that really go against our fundamental democratic values and rights of citizens that are at play here. And so I think we really need to study very carefully. And I would come back to, this is why we need really objective analysis in a nonpartisan, in kind of a cool-headed way of what really are the costs and benefits for consumers, for research, for human progress. All of these, anything that constrains these, there are reasons to do so, legitimate national security reasons, and I don't think there are very many people who question that, but it's just so easy to overshoot, and that has real costs to us as an economy. And so I think I just conclude this segment by saying I think in Canada we have an opportunity to study and learn from the experience of other jurisdictions that have gone a bit further down this road, like the US, like Australia, like the UK, and to try to avoid some of what I would say are the mistakes that they have made in doing this. So I would put that forward as one measure for the government of Canada and the Parliament of Canada to take to try to mitigate some of the risks that we see in this emerging world of decoupling, and it's maybe a good opportunity to throw the discussion out more widely to the rest of the group on what kind of practical measures the rest of us on the panel would suggest in that regard.
Look, I think I think the implication of Chris's question and your response, Jeff, is exactly right, that before we jump to decoupling, what are we decoupling? And as you pointed out, Jeff, if you're decoupling from your own citizens because of their origin, we have a problem. And it's not unusual. History has lots of examples of that, in Canada too, by the way. And so let's keep that in mind. Second, what is your long-term goal? And before we talk about decoupling, how about we get coupling right? And so I think there's lots of room for global diplomacy, because this is a greenfield area. In digital, we are where the world was in 1944. In 1944, the world looked bleak. And the concept of peace and prosperity through economic integration was kind of alluring, but we didn't quite know how to get there. And in fact, many people thought it was a bad idea. But we persisted, and we have a system that served us well for many decades. And so rather than even talk about decoupling, I'd much rather talk about managing globalization, which is I think what this is about. Two specific thoughts on that. One, at CIGI, we've made the proposal, and I'll just summarize it here, for a so-called Digital Stability Board. So if you look at what happened after the global financial crisis in 2007-8, we had a financial system that was poorly regulated, and we were sort of deluding ourselves by thinking if we left banks alone, they were smart, they knew what they were doing. Turns out they were, but you still needed some rules and norms around that. And so the Financial Stability Forum, which became the Financial Stability Board, which is the only really new institution we've created in this generation, came about. And so we might want to think of the digital sector as one that requires this kind of perhaps multi-stakeholder institution, in which norms are exchanged, in which over time standards are set and bad actors penalized. But that's the way to do it. I think I come back to my point about weaponizing the SWIFT payment system. In a matter of days, if not hours, the world kind of piled on to the sense of using the SWIFT payment system to penalize a clearly bad actor. So this is not about saying Russia is on the right, but we did it without any sense of what the long-term implication is or why SWIFT. What you've done is, in the process, given the bad actors an opportunity to attack what is a global public good, which is the global financial payment system. And so by weaponizing things that are actually sources of cooperation and prosperity, we're not even achieving the ends that we say we want to achieve. Again, to use a historical analogy, I think it's called the Rome Convention, where countries, even during war, agree not to attack archaeological sites. So you won't bomb the Vatican, you won't bomb the Taj Mahal. Is the global financial system ready for that kind of global accord, in which you say some things are off limits in the digital world, one of which could be payment system? There's no reason why we couldn't think of having norms around so-called backdoors in technology. there's no reason why we couldn't regulate technology rather than assume that it will be used for the worst and therefore let's avoid it. I think those are the kinds of areas for diplomacy that goes well beyond, that goes into technical realms that we have to be thinking about before we think about giving up and talking about decoupling.
I would just build on some of Rohinton's comments, especially the idea of things like the Digital Stability Board. And to me, I think what's more important about when we think about coupling and decoupling, what I would really like to see happen is kind of a decoupling of the clear differentiated governance models for digital technology. I think, and come up with new institutions and governance capabilities for this technology. I think, China has clearly pioneered the ability to use digital technology and digital surveillance for regime survival and regime societal control. And I think it's a mistake to think that some of those technologies aren't going to be used in democratic contexts because they already are, right? Like the number of CCTV cameras, for example, in New York isn't really that different per capita than it is in Beijing. What's different, or should be different, is the governance structures that we put in place around those technologies. This kind of builds on a lot of the conversation we had earlier. I know Rohinton also mentioned kind of the different data models that are around the world. I think what would be great is if we could spend the next few years really developing a robust set of norms and standards around governance of data and governance of algorithms, so that it's very clear to the, I think Jeff made this point earlier that most people are not in the US, EU, or China, right? There's 5 billion people outside of those zones. There should be clear alternatives to just the kind of autocratic uses of these technologies that China's kind of pioneered and exported. And the clearer we can make those, the more robust we can develop those kind of models, the better off we'll all be. So hopefully that's something that we can push forward in the years to come.
I'm also wondering if we are not overlooking the potentially empowering effect of technology for dissident movements or any type of resistance to the government, or it doesn't necessarily have to be dissident, but opposition or voices of the people, because we've seen that over the last 5 to 10 years. We've seen an increase in civic activism pretty much everywhere in the world, including in Europe, empowered by technology, because people can connect, because people can find like-minded people online. I mean, all of this hinges on the internet, of course, but there is also the side of the internet that nobody controls. Now, you could argue, well, China has managed to bar access to that, but even out of China, we get some messages, so the wall, the Great China Wall, is not absolute. There are some cracks in the wall. So I'm wondering if that's also worth looking deeper into, because it's not just a tool in the hands of the government. I think perhaps that's a surprising thing. Again, I come back to Ukraine, where we see that the original and innovative way of commercially available drones has actually helped the Ukrainians. So it's not just a tool in the hands of government. I think it's also potentially a tool in the hands of those that want to hold the government accountable. One other side effect, for instance, I'm thinking corruption. Iraq is one of the most corrupt countries on earth. Well, since they digitalized the port of Basra, that port has made a huge turnover, because now there's a digital trace of things that go in and out, and corruption is simply no longer as possible as before. So there are silver linings here. I think it's very important to show that we're looking at a very big landscape of grays, rather than just the extreme ends that end up catching all the attention.
And your example, Florence, actually illustrates the point I think we all have been making, that technology is not a power unto itself, but is driven by humans, is for humans, and is driven by values. And so, your Basra example is one in which if you fundamentally have a political economic system that wants reform and that wants less corruption, then technology enables you to get there. But we cannot substitute laws and norms and human rights values by having a technological fix. Technology has to be, and that's why I appreciated Chris's point, and I should have made it. Algorithmic accountability, I think, is that next frontier. We can't take algorithms as given, as black boxes and as proprietary. If I run a firm, a factory floor firm, I have dozens of inspections and laws and forms I have to fill out. If my factory form is the production of an algorithm, none of that exists. Well, why not? So I think we simply have to apply analog solutions to digital areas using traditional ways and find that we could get a lot further than we have so far.
And I think we need to also ask ourselves when we're as societies, when we're making these decisions and taking the measures, particularly relating to prospects of decoupling, you know, in the long run, is this something that will make us more secure or less secure? And sometimes the thing in the short term that you think will make you more secure is actually pretty demonstrably going to make you less secure in the long run. And we have to, that's why we need a very kind of dispassionate, objective debate. And also in countries like Canada, we need a debate that really focuses on what we need as Canadians and what will serve our security interests best, our prosperity interests and our values interests best, and you know, and keep those always, you know, in the forefront as we're making these choices.
Well, thank you very, very, very much. We're so glad that we invited you to have this conversation. It's such an important part of actually when you look at the future, we really believe some of the decisions, some of the things that are happening, or some of the decisions you're talking about as potential solutions will shape our future. So I'm so grateful that you were here with us, Florence, Jeff, Chris, and Rohinton. Thank you very much, and we look forward to continuing engaging with you.
To learn more about Foresight and read our latest reports, please visit horizons.gc.ca.